James Evan was just a mechanic stationed at the edge of human space, living a quiet life among scrap ships and humming engines. He liked things that made sense: cogs, circuits, things you could take apart and fix. What he didn't like was attention, royalty, or the idea of getting pulled into some grand alien mess. But all of that changed when a glowing emissary ship arrived outside his docking bay, bearing a message he couldn't refuse. It wasn't a job request or a warning, it was a summons. The message was clear: by decree of the Royal Intergalactic Union, James was now the legal husband to Princess Talranai of the Tentacled Dominion. He laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. A human marrying a tentacled alien princess. It sounded like something out of a bad joke. But when the emissary appeared in front of him, in person tall, robed in violet, and quite serious, James realized this wasn't a joke at all. It was a royal contract, sealed by deathbed decree of the late Tentacled king, and refusal. Not allowed. Hours later, James was on a royal cruiser headed for the Tentacled capital. The galaxy's media had already picked up the story: human husband, marriage by will. What was the king thinking? News networks, both human and alien, were having a field day. The Galactic Council laughed openly. Of course the humans would end up with the tentacled one. A reptilian ambassador mocked on -air. James didn't care about their opinions. He had bigger problems, like the fact that he'd never even met the princess. She stood tall when he arrived, 7 feet of shimmering turquoise skin, with fluid tendrils instead of hair and silver-ringed eyes that watched him like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She was strange and elegant in a way he couldn't describe. Alien, yes, but not grotesque, just unfamiliar. You are smaller than I imagined, she said. You're taller than I hoped, he replied. A beat passed and then she smiled. Not many saw it, but her eyes shifted just slightly. That was how Tentacrans smiled. Their wedding was a formality signed by council, observed by interstellar nobles, and broadcast to trillions. James stood awkwardly beside Talranai, while the council watched in amusement. The king's last decree had been clear: let peace be sealed in bloodless union. My daughter shall marry the one no one expects, the human. They thought it was a joke, a humiliation. The idea that a noble Tentacran princess would be tied to a low-born, soft-skinned human was hilarious to them. Even Talranai herself seemed unsure. She barely spoke to James during their first weeks together, and when she did, her tone was clipped, formal, distant. But James didn't force anything. He stayed calm, stayed helpful, and asked questions no one else asked her, like how the royal engines were maintained, or what kind of food she actually liked beyond ceremonial dishes. She began to open up in small ways. She let him see the royal gardens. She watched as he tinkered with old Terran tech, curious about how humans fixed things with so little. The Galactic Council continued to mock. One ambassador went so far as to call her the Queen of Pity, married to a human out of desperation. It didn't matter. James wasn't trying to win over the council. He was trying to survive and, maybe, just maybe, build a bridge. Until one night, when things shifted, a foreign dignitary insulted Talranai at a diplomatic gala. The king's last gift, he said loudly, was a human puppy to keep his daughter company. The room laughed. But James didn't. He stood. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply walked up to the dignitary and asked if he'd ever built anything with his own hands. You laugh at me, James said, But I can fix your ship, reroute your power core, and reprogram your security drones. Can you? The dignitary scoffed. But Talranai said nothing. She simply took James's hand, right there in front of the room. That silence, that gesture, made the laughter stop for the first time. They weren't laughing. They were watching. After the gala incident, everything changed. The court no longer laughed quite so loudly. The Galactic Council's jokes lost their edge, and Talranai, the princess with ribbons of bioluminescent skin and a voice like silver wind, began to truly see James not just as the human she had been forced to marry, but as something far more curious. She started joining him during his repair sessions. At first, she said nothing, simply watching as he sat cross-legged on the floor with scattered pieces of old engine components. James talked anyway about fuses, gravity coils, and how human ships used instinct as much as math. You humans. Guess, she said one day, a slight tilt to her head. Your machines shouldn't fly. And yet, they do. James shrugged, smiling. That's kind of our thing. We shouldn't do half the things we do. And she smiled back. Her smile looked nothing like a human's. No lips, no teeth, just a ripple through her skin, like a wave under moonlight. But James recognized it all the same. Days turned into weeks, and Talranai began asking questions. She wanted to understand human culture, not the history books, but the little things. Why did humans sit by fires? Why did they name ships after people? Why did they talk to machines like pets? James answered everything. Not because he wanted to impress her, but because it was nice to talk to someone who actually listened. One evening, they found themselves in the Royal Arboretum, under the glow of floating pollen orbs. She asked him what Earth smelled like. He described fresh rain, motor oil, pine forests, and warm bread. She leaned closer and said, I've never smelled any of those. We'll get you there someday, James promised. Softly, Talranai looked away for a moment. No one has ever promised me something that wasn't political. That hit James harder than he expected. But their peace didn't last. A week later, during a formal council assembly, a threat emerged. The nobles from House Kyrith, longtime rivals of the Tentacled crown, demanded Talranai annul the marriage. They argued it was an embarrassment to their species' a stain on the legacy of their fallen king. This human, their speaker snarled, is a novelty act, not a consort. A tool of pity. Let the union be dissolved. There is still time. James didn't speak. Neither did Talranai. For a moment, it looked as though the council might succeed. Murmurs echoed across the chamber. Dissolution, disgrace, diplomatic reversal. Then Talranai stood, and she didn't just speak. She roared. Her voice filled the entire chamber with a tremor no technology could replicate. You call him a novelty. Then let me remind you, it was this novelty who stood for me while you laughed, who repaired the royal cruiser without asking for a crown, who stood beside me when my own kin stayed silent. She turned to James, her many eyes locked on his. You call him unworthy. I call him chosen. Silence fell. House Kyrith withdrew their petition in shame. Later that night, back in their private quarters, Talranai sat quietly beside James, watching the stars from their open viewport. Her voice was gentle this time. I was afraid, you know, that you'd see me as they do, a monster, a burden, a mistake. James shook his head slowly. You're none of those things. You're strange, sure, but you're brave, you listen. You care more than you admit. I don't care what they see, I know what I see. He didn't touch her, not yet. But the silence between them grew comfortable, familiar, intimate. She let her tendrils wrap gently around his wrist, a gesture of trust. That night, the union once mocked by empires felt like something more than a royal trick. It felt real, and for the first time since arriving in her world, James no longer felt like just a mechanic from nowhere. He felt like he belonged, and to Renai she was no longer just the tentacled princess of the Dominion. She was his, and the galaxy was beginning to notice. Word of the princess's defense of James spread fast, not just across the royal court, but through the Empire's shadowy corners, where enemies listened and plotted. No one had expected her to speak with such fire. No one had expected a human to stay, and certainly no one had expected them to bond. James noticed it first in the looks from the palace staff. No more snickering, no more quiet murmurs behind his back, just respectful nods, maybe even sympathy. They'd seen him stay, seen him fight, seen him protect. Whatever he had been before a joke, a novelty, he wasn't that anymore. Renai changed too. She walks taller, more confident. Not because of James, but because someone had finally stood beside her without trying to control her. It made her dangerous in a new way, unshackled, and people in power feared that, especially House Kyreth. Their first attempt to annul the marriage had failed. Now they moved quietly, whispering through the shadows. Allies, bribes, mercenaries. Plans began to form in secret chambers far from the Tentacran capital. Meanwhile, James and Renai spent their days navigating the political waves of the Empire together. He had no royal training, no noble etiquette, but he had something more useful: honesty. People were drawn to him because he didn't play games, because he listened and then he acted. In one meeting with an influential mining guild, the head negotiator refused to deal with the human pet. James simply rolled up his sleeves, walked to their failing gravity core, and fixed it mid-meeting right there on the floor in front of everyone. The negotiator watched in stunned silence. "That was impossible," he muttered. "Not impossible," James said. "Just needed care." After that, the mining guild signed the treaty. Renai didn't say much afterward, but later that evening, she left a single metallic flower on James's desk. Tentacran tradition. It meant deep respect, but peace was never permanent. Late one night, as James was inspecting a malfunctioning solar array on the palace rooftop, a shadow moved behind him. He turned and ducked just in time to avoid a blade slicing toward his neck. An assassin, silent, fast, and not human. James fought like a mechanic, not a soldier. He threw tools. He dodged, scrambled, improvised. A plasma torch swung like a club. A wrench caught the assassin's leg. But the attacker was trained, relentless. A sharp blow sent James tumbling across the rooftop, bleeding. The assassin raised his blade again, but stopped suddenly. A tendril pierced the assassin's chest from behind. Renai stood there, breathless, her bioluminescent skin pulsing with fury. She didn't speak. She simply let the body fall and rushed to James. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. James winced, but managed to grin. "You should have seen the other guy." She didn't laugh. Instead, she pressed her forehead to his Tentacran gesture of deep affection. "I can't lose you," she whispered. And that's when James knew this wasn't just duty anymore. This was love. Strange, beautiful, alien love. but love all the same. The assassination attempt changed everything. Security tightened. Investigations began. The blade used was traced rare metal, exclusive to Kyrith Holdings. The message was clear. The Council's jokes had turned to fear, and fear had turned to violence. But the attack only strengthened the bond between James and Tal. Ariana, the palace halls that once echoed with laughter now whispered of war. They weren't just a joke anymore, they were a threat. Together, the palace was no longer just a home, it was a fortress. After the failed assassination, every corner of the Tentacran capital buzzed with tension. Nobles arrived with guarded entourages. High-ranking guards whispered about battle formations. And in the heart of it all, James and Talranai stood together, no longer mocked, but watched, feared, and in some cases, revered. It wasn't just because of the attack. It was because something had shifted in Talranai. Her presence, once distant and ceremonial, was now commanding. She walked into meetings like a storm cloaked in grace. She made decisions that unsettled the old lords. She spoke not just as a daughter of the king, but as a ruler in her own right. And James, he was always by her side. He never tried to control her, never interrupted. He just observed, advised, and spoke when others missed what mattered. You see things differently, Talranai told him once, after a tense negotiation. Not from above, from the ground. That's because that's where I've always lived, he replied. She nodded. Maybe that's where true rulers should come from. Still, the threat of Kyrith grew louder with each passing day. One evening, an emergency alert brought James and Talranai racing to the war room. A fleet had entered Tentacran space unauthorized, heavily armed, and broadcasting a single message: surrender the throne or be erased. It was fleet, dozens of warships, enough firepower to reduce the palace to ashdot. The council panicked. Half wanted to negotiate, half wanted to flee. But Talranai stood tall in the center of the chamber and spoke only 2 words: we fight. Her command sent ripples across the chamber. The military loyalists snapped to attention. Generals swore oaths. Even some old rivals pledged their fleets. But it wasn't enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned. That's when James did something unexpected. He left the war room while chaos swirled around battle plans and noble panic. James made his way to the underbelly of the city, back to the old industrial bays, to the scrap yards, to the people no royal had spoken to in generations. He called in favors. He offered parts, promised freedom from the corrupt noble rule of Kyrith, promised a future, and people listened. The ground crews, the merchant pilots, the tech pirates, the old salvagers who had once called James a joke now stood behind him with jury-rigged freighters, reactivated battle drones, and patched up ships from the forgotten wars. By morning, the sky over the capital had changed. Dozens of ragtag vessels hovered behind the royal fleet, burned, dented, slow but burning with loyalty, and in front of them, the Kyrith Armada loomed. James returned to the palace in time for the final strategy meeting. Talranai met him at the door. You left without a word, she said, trying to sound angry. I came back with a fleet, James said. She stared at him for a moment, then laughed. A rare, real, open laugh. Her tendrils brushed his hand. Then, let's win. The battle began at first light. Kyroth's ships descended like black thunderclouds. Their first volley shook the capital walls, but Talranai's forces held firm. And from the clouds, James's patchwork fleet descended firing in messy, chaotic formations that the enemy didn't expect. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't noble, but it worked. James fought on the ground, coordinating defenses and rallying troops. Talranai led from the command ship, her voice broadcast through every Allied channel. We do not kneel, we do not run. Today we rise. Hours passed in fire and fury, and then the Kyrith flagship, massive and plated in obsidian armor, broke through the lines, headed straight for the palace. Only one ship stood in its path, the royal cruiser, piloted by Talranai herself. She charged straight into the enemy's core, activating a cascade overload in the last of her father's technology, a pulse bomb that shattered the Kyrith flagship's shields, exposed its core, and allowed James's ground cannons to finish the job. When the enemy ship exploded over the capital, the sky lit with fire. The city roared Kairoth's fleet, seeing their flagship fall, scattered in retreat. And in the silence that followed, Talranai's voice echoed across the system. The throne is no longer for those born to rule. It is for those who choose to fight for it. The war was over. The sky above the Tentacran capital was filled with drifting embers and damaged ships, some still hovering, others gently descending under emergency power. The once pristine palace spires were scorched, cracked, and broken in places, but they still stood, just like the people beneath them. James stood on a battered rooftop overlooking the main square. His clothes were torn. Grease and blood streaked his face. He had burns on one arm and a limp from shrapnel, but he was still standing. Talranai landed beside him moments later, disembarking from the smouldering remains of the royal cruiser. Her once glistening ceremonial robes were now stained with smoke, torn across one shoulder, but her eyes, they burned brighter than ever. "Is it done?" James asked. She nodded. Kyrith's remaining ships fled. Their council allies are denouncing them publicly. We've won. For a moment there was no sound, just the wind drifting through a city trying to breathe again. Then the cheering started, not from the nobles or generals, from the streets below, from the people, the workers, the outcasts, the salvagers. James had rallied, the civilians who had watched the battle from their rooftops, praying they wouldn't be next. They weren't cheering for a victory, they were cheering for them. Talranai turned toward James, and without hesitation, wrapped a pair of her glowing tendrils gently around his shoulders. "You gave them hope," she said softly. He smiled. "We gave them something to fight for." The next day, the Galactic Council held a session to address the chaos of the Tentacran Empire. Representatives from 100 systems gathered on the floating space station hall, their robes impeccable, their speeches rehearsed. They expected to see a broken world sending a replacement. What they got was something else entirely. Walked into the chamber with her head high, flanked by her sisters and a few loyal guards. She wore a new kind of crown, not the traditional lattice of gold and bone, but a simple metal ring crafted from the salvaged hull of the cruiser she had flown in battle. Behind her stood James, not in armor or robes, but in his usual work gear, patched, worn with pride. One of the council members sneered. "The mechanic still plays at royalty." James stepped forward. "Not royalty," he said calmly. "Just someone who refused to leave." Another ambassador asked, "And what of your marriage? Will this charade continue?" Talranai raised a hand. "Let me be clear," she said. "My union with James Everin began with a command, but what has grown between us was not decreed. It was chosen, with time, with trust, with pain." She paused, letting her voice echo. You called us a joke. But the joke is over. He is no longer just my husband. He is my partner, my advisor, my equal. There was silence in the chamber. Then murmurs, then a ripple of reluctant applause after the council meeting. As they boarded their return ship, James turned to Talranier. Did we just win the galaxy? She tilted her head. No, but we just made it pay attention. Back on Zintar, the Tentacran capital, the palace was being rebuilt, not in the same shape, but with new designs, simpler, more open, and in the center garden, where once only nobles walked, now walked citizens and children, and there, beside the new fountain, a statue was raised, not of Talrani alone, but of her standing with James, not holding swords, not wearing crowns, just standing side by side, equal, one night under the glowing twin moons. Talrani and James sat on the balcony of their private chamber. No guards, no politics, just them. Do you miss Earth? She asked quietly. Sometimes, he said, but not the way I thought I would. She turned to face him, eyes glowing in the dark. Why not? Because I didn't find a new planet. He said, I found a home. Talruni smiled in that rippling way he had come to love, and this time she reached for his hand first. They had started as strangers in a marriage no one wanted. They had been mocked, threatened, nearly destroyed. But in the end, the galaxy that laughed at them now looked up to them, and they had built something real, together, the end.